Good evening, and welcome to the Linbury Theatre here at the Royal Opera House. I'm Uzma Hamid, and in tonight's Insight, we'll be exploring a new multimedia opera adaptation of Woman at Point Zero, which is presented as part of this year's Engender Festival. Inspired by the seminal novel by Egyptian feminist writer Nawal El-Saadawi, Woman at Point Zero centres around an encounter between two very different women. Fatma, who is on death row awaiting execution for killing a man, and Summer, a documentary filmmaker who comes to interview her. Their conversation reaches across differences in background and class to expose their shared predicament as women in a highly patriarchal society. Woman at Point Zero is part of the Royal Opera's 4th annual Engender Festival, celebrating groundbreaking work from women and non-binary opera makers, creatives, and change makers. This production is also part of Shubak Festival and Aldborough Festival 2023. For tonight's Insight, I'm delighted to be in conversation with composer Bushra El-Turk, conductor Kanako Abe, and joint CEO of Shubak Festival, Alia Al-Zoukbi. Welcome, and thank you for joining this conversation. So I'd love to start, if I could get you to each briefly introduce yourself, and then perhaps say how you came to El-Saadawi's work and to be involved in the project. And let's start with you, Bushra. Perhaps say a few words about your background, and then what was your first experience of the novel, and what inspired you to want to write an opera about it?
But a lot of questions. So I was born in London, of Lebanese heritage, and fast forward to how this opera came about. It landed on my lap while I was in a concert, and at that moment I was writing my first opera about honor killing from the perspective of a mother, and it was a monodrama. And I was very, always been captivated by the idea of imprisonment and captivity. And so when that landed on my lap, I thought it was like the perfect vehicle perfect narrative. It was so powerful. It was a visceral experience. So many women had been affected by it. I was strongly emotionally affected by it. I related to it on some level. And it kind of, her language jumped off the page for me, and I felt like I could stage it somehow, and it went through 2 phases. So the first phase was a research and development that explored the explosion of music into movement. But then there was a whole re-evaluation, in that we thought to adapt it into a multimedia opera with director Leila Sleiman and writer Stacey Hardy and stage designer Bisan al-Sharif, and documentary filmmaker Aida Al-Kashif at the time, who was collaborating with us. And we were hoping to bring a 40-something-year-old story set in Cairo, set in Egypt, to the present day, using archival material from women's voices, from women from the actual prison that the original character Firdaus was set in. So probably something like 7 years ago that this footage was made of these women, or some sound recordings we had. And they were all in prison for killing their husbands, and they were all on death row. And so we wanted to bring it to the present day, integrating these voices that you will hear, these snippets you will hear in the opera tonight, somehow into the fabric of the sound world and of the musical world, into the opera, and then also integrated quite organically within the text.
Amazing, thank you. And Kanako,
yes.
Can I ask you, you're conducting the work, but you're also a composer in your own right.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, when you first got invited into this collaboration, what spoke to you about the work, and you know, how that came about, how your involvement came about?
Yeah, I'm conductor based in Europe. I'm Japanese, but I spend more time here in Europe. And then, as I am graduated first at the competition class in Tokyo, since I collaborate with lot of composer, and so far I already made more than 180 world premiere as a conductor. And some of composers recommended my name to Bushra. That's why I was introduced to Bushra and Lot production people, and to Laila as well. And I was very passionate by the topic and by the motivation coming from all team members. And with very nice atmosphere. Each one listened very well, others' opinion, with very respective regard. This mood, I really appreciate it.
Lovely. And coming to you, Alia, so you are joint CEO of Shubak, which is the UK's largest festival of contemporary Arab cultures. And I believe you're a storyteller as well, so perhaps you could say just something about yourself. And then I'd love it if you could maybe set the context for us and say a little about El-Saadawi and you know, who she was and the importance of her work in world literature.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so I'm joint CEO of Shubak Festival alongside Tagrij Er Vizoso, and we took over a couple of years ago, and I think it's really worth saying that this piece of work, Bushra had been in conversation and collaboration and work with Shubak for a long time before that. In fact, the first version I witnessed was in 2017. And then Lod took it over and brought it to what you're seeing on the stage today. So acknowledging the kind of gift that was offered to us when we first took over at Shubak, to have this, it really was a gift for us to be, you know, we can only take so much credit for work that's been in the making for so many years. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. But Nawal El-Saadawi, my relationship goes much, like a long time before that. And her work, I first came across Imra'a Taht Khat Sifr, which is Woman at Point Zero in Arabic, because she originally wrote that in Arabic. And in fact, maybe we can talk about that more, but Nawal El-Saadawi reached a point in her life where she refused to speak or write in English. And we can talk about more about that, because that's a very important aspect of her and who she was for us. But I was at university, at the American University of Beirut. I grew up in the region. I'm part Lebanese, part Syrian as well. And grew up in different parts, different countries in the region. But it was only when I got to university that I was exposed to Nawal El-Saadawi's radical work. And it was at a time when so many of us young women were trying to lean into feminism, but on our own terms, not in a Western framework of feminism. And we knew that we had cultural production in the region where the feminist perspective existed, but was being silenced by a largely Western-facing education, which we were receiving. So when I first read this book, you know, it was really something that allowed us to turn to our own selves and our own histories and our own knowledges and wisdoms, and own a certain narrative around feminism that is ours, if you like. And Nawal El-Saadawi personified that. And I think it's really important when you have that person. It's just, we're all storytellers, right? And it's just every one of us in this room is a storyteller. And when we have a person that we can go to and that personifies this cause, if you like, it just makes a lot more sense for us. And because they take that form, where these ideas are kind of encapsulated, if you like, it just becomes something that you can turn to and return to. And that's what Nawal El-Saadawi is to us. Very controversial in the region, but for so many of us, the feminist that we all turn to.
Yeah, amazing role model and, as you say, kind of iconic person who very much lived what she believed at great personal risk.
Exactly.
And am I right in thinking that you met her in the course of thinking about this production?
So jealous.
Yeah, me too. All really jealous.
That smug nod.
So what was she like? What was it like?
What was she like? Well, what you see is what she's like. I mean, all the YouTube videos you will watch. But she was very warm to the idea of me writing an opera on Women at Point Zero. There had been other productions of Women at Point Zero, which are more like theatre productions, I think. And, well, there's only so much an author of a work will actually like of what she sees in terms of reimagining of her work and stuff. But, I mean, who knows if she will approve of this one. Yeah. But I didn't, so when I met her, we discussed all the, just to really just get into grips with the character and how she related to the character and this fiction, fact, or faction as she calls it, that is very prominent in this particular work, but I think quite some other works as well, but also how that kind of explodes into the opera in terms of our facts and fiction with it. Not fiction, but in terms of the stage, the imaginary stage versus the
Well, I did want to ask you about that actually, because you're right. I think she described it as being halfway between fiction and fact. And it's when you read the novel, it's this very curious blend between kind of a biography, fiction, even the writing is very poetic at times, despite the really kind of gritty subject matter. So I'm kind of wondering how that blend is reflected in the sort of multidimensionality of the staging.
So complex. Where do I start?
Yeah. I mean, I guess you've got these kind of documentary elements as well, haven't you? You've got the sort of documentary, but again, the beautiful music, which is, in a way, to me, I guess it's kind of subtext, but, you tell me how.
Well, I mean, ultimately, we wanted to, there was a lot of compartmentalization on the stage, as you might notice, these lines, and and also in the video as well. There's a lot of constricted views and framed views that you will notice, and in the music also I explore that and freedom and what that means, and in a sense, I mean, I integrate improvisation a lot with the ensemble and with the singers, and so fiction and fact, it's hard to describe it on those points, but maybe you could help me elaborate on that.
Yeah, I was very fascinated by her way of perceiving opera work, which was very new for me, because I had several experience to conduct contemporary opera, but her opera, which is very strong point, was she has that generosity to give us the liberty, the freedom, and she proposes us, each of musicians, some ideas. For example, that kind of figure. For example, that kind of rhythm. And the rest, it's up to you. And we can improvise as we feel, according to the mood of the day, according to the energy of each audience. That's why every performance has the completely different result artistically. I can't even guess what's going on before to start the show. So, including tonight's one, and I'm very excited. And that's, I think, should be the next generation of opera work, how it should be in more respective and democratic way of creation.
Wonderful. So we'll talk a little bit more about the music, because there's so much to kind of talk about in that respect. But I just wanted to ask you also about the relationship between these two women. And of course, in the opera, you've kind of updated it to now. So the book was written in 1975, I believe, but we have a revolutionary, and I believe you mentioned Tahrir Square and the protests there. So how important was it to you that you bring it right up to date? And to what extent do you think the issues facing women are still the same?
Well, in terms of the issues facing women still being the same, I mean, we all, I don't know, some people think it's all much better. But if you look at in the global perspective, I saw a really interesting, I don't know if you saw it as well, it was in a magazine that had a snakes and ladders picture on the progress of women's rights in the world. Snakes and ladders. So obviously some things have improved, but a lot of things have just completely gone down to the Middle Ages.
Improved and gone back.
Yeah. And in terms of the complex, the relationship between the two characters. I mean, so originally in the book we have just the Firdaus, who's the original character, who Nawal El-Saadawi is waiting for. She's constantly waiting to come, and there's a kind of prologue and end point that frames the work. But we wanted to bring the story of two women that it really kind of questions the power dynamics of our society around class, generational differences between women, different roles and ways of navigating the world, and violence against women. And somehow, I don't know if I went off on a tangent from your question.
No,
but
it's all in there.
It's all in there, yeah.
Great. So let's delve a little bit more into the music now, which blends both Western and Eastern musical traditions and performed on a range of different kind of ancient folk instruments. Bushra, I've heard you described it as a harmonic playground. Can you say what you mean by that?
So the ensemble for me is my kind of experimental harmonic playground.
Okay.
Each of them, I mean, there is a saying that choosing your collaborators is half the work done. And they each, in their own creative, like their improvisations and their perspectives and aesthetics of music, kind of represent my sound world in a way. And each being of different cultural traditions from both, they bring their own kind of international perspective on the themes of the opera. And I've done it in a way that's kind of paired, for example, the accordion with the sho, which is the mouth organ from Japan, and the string department, which is the cello and the Persian kamancha and kechek, and the two wind players who play the Korean taigum, and Rafaela, who plays multiple instruments, all doubling, of the Slovakian fioara and the Armenian duduk and recorders and the Bulgarian kaval. And yeah, and I have a system which kind of represents what we're trying to do in the opera, that, you know, in terms of the imprisonment, that we it's a spectrum between the fixed notated to the fully improvised. So what Kanako was talking about earlier is those little windows of open scores that you'll find. And sometimes, I mean, they're all composers as well. And I call them, in a way, I'm orchestrating personalities, really. They're not the instruments, it's the people behind them that's important for me. And they're all rebels of their own traditions. No two taigum players are the same.
Yeah.
And that's what we all are, in a way. We're all kind of rebels of our own traditions, you know?
Amazing. That's a great quote. We're all rebels of our own traditions. I love that. And so you've talked about this sort of moments where I guess it's a bit freer and there's that sort of improvisational element. Why is that important to have that freedom?
Well, it kind of brings the essence and their own personal perspectives onto it much more. So, and it's more interesting for me when I'm working with them. It becomes a very kind of fluid dialogue, both musically and textually, when we're having this kind of artistic banter and dialogue together.
Yeah, yeah, amazing. Kanika, I
elaborate
wonder if you
on
could
that?
talk a little bit more about that. You know, so what's it like working with these amazing musicians and this score and these moments where,
Yes.
I guess in a way. So perhaps you could just explain a little bit more, first of all, what we mean when we say open score.
It was my very first experience to have such a free part everywhere in the score. And for me, when I think of the word freedom, I always think about responsibility. So freedom holds responsibility. It means that if we are free of expressing, we have more responsibility and we have more consciousness about what we are doing. And then in the performance, every musician get more active and it gives more energy. And I see only a positive point about performing art to add more improvisation part. If we have excellent musicians who can improvise very spontaneously. I saw the chemical effect of miracle of each different improvisation because no one only improvisation exists. So each improvisation with many different factors changes. And that's the reality of the humanity, I think.
So what does that require from you when you are conducting a score like that and you know there's going to be these moments of improvisation? What does that require from you? What does it require from the musicians and also the singers?
So I can't define one only answer because I am just observing all conditions. So if singer seems to be a bit tired, I just shorten her improvisation and let others to improvise more. Or if singers would like to go more, I just give the sign to play smaller other part just to give more spaces. So yeah, I think this performance is exactly the miniature of what happens in human being relationship. And all is the matter of listening each other and observing, analyzing, try to understand each other and find the space for each one.
And how do you make sure, I guess because we're all, even as artists, we all have our sort of habits, our sort of ways of being creative, if you like. So how do you ensure that in those improvisational sections everybody keeps it fresh, or are they just very up for it and that they're always themselves wanting to keep it fresh? Or do you feel like you have to do certain exercises or ways of keep shifting the parameters in a way?
I think our members are really, really creative, and I don't need any support. Spontaneously, they can give their idea, and my mission is how to coordinate. So, to be honest, in this production, I consider myself as a coordinator. But on stage, as you see, I am holding also the role of director of the prison. So the director of the prison who conducts all prisoners playing the music on stage.
Oh, I see. So it's a whole different level of performativity for you as a conductor. So I knew you were on stage with the musicians. I hadn't realised you're also in another role as well.
Yeah. And we are, all musicians are supposed to say something, sometimes kind of singing or make a jest or shout sometimes. We are all actors.
Amazing, thank you. So let's move on and talk a little bit about women in opera and in music, both as makers and subjects of the work, and focusing perhaps on those from the global majority. So Bushra, I'd like to ask you, what you think music and opera specifically offers as a vehicle of expression for this kind of really contemporary, hard-hitting, thematic work. We'll start there.
I think the answer's in your question.
Is it?
It is.
Well, do unpack it for me.
Yeah, well, it's the perfect vehicle of expression because there's so many elements at play, always dancing with each other, always blurring with each other, and they're not separate. And that's part of, because there's sometimes what you want to say can't be said in words. You want to move with it, with what you want to say. You express it through what you want to see.
Yeah.
And there are always better ways to express something, to really get close to the nugget of what you want to say. So opera is the perfect vehicle for that.
Yeah.
When all these elements come, they're choreographed together.
Great.
Somehow.
And I know that you are an all-female creative team and female producer. So I'm sort of wondering to what extent also you feel that some of these themes of male domination and relegation of women, even exploitation of women, apply to the opera form itself, and to what extent your kind of your ensemble, your work is trying to break through some of that.
I don't know how to answer that.
Can I?
Yes,
just as someone who observed, who is an audience member, and also listening to you now, I find it fascinating that about a piece that is ultimately about freedom has the mechanics of freedom built into it. You know, like the whole methodology and approach has this mechanics of spaciousness and allowance and permission and playfulness. And this might sound controversial, but there is something very feminine about that, you know? So moving away from the binary of this is male and this is female, but kind of embracing that we each, regardless of what our gender is, are fluid, and we're increasingly starting to embrace that. So seeing this kind of very feminine approach, and now learning even more about the background of it, and actually that it's built into the language of how the performance comes across every night. There's something really quite touching and magical about that, you know? So yes, speaking about kind of deconstructing the what can be very hierarchical modes of production, not just in the world around us, but how they're then interpreted into the artistic process, being rebelliously deconstructed and taken apart, and going, like for someone like Bushra, who can have a lot of power to say, actually I relinquish, you know, and I'm choosing to relinquish, is exactly what you said. It has to be the future. It has to be the present and the future. Yeah.
So sometimes we need some words to be clarified, our wish, our opinion. But beyond of words, we trust that there is always music who can send to people stronger messages. That's why we are in love with music. And for that, the performing art, like opera work, has very, very loud message, but non-verbal, but very loud inside message through the music.
And so, Kanika, how important is it? Well, first of all, how important are initiatives like Engender in bringing some of this feminine work to the fore? And then also, I'd like to ask you how important you think it is that that work takes place here at the Royal Opera House, which perhaps is, you know, the kind of the bastion of tradition, the establishment, the holder of this amazing kind of musical history.
Yes, personally, I'm so honored to be able to perform here in Royal Opera House, which is one of the 5 biggest opera houses in the world. And it's very meaningful, the selection choice of repertory, casting, everything, which are happening in this house, because it has huge influence for any other institutions or artistic field. And I am so happy that more and more people are sensitive to integrate feminine presence into every project. And as a female conductor, more to say as a female Asian, Japanese conductor, I am very often asked the question, how do you feel to be a female conductor? It should be very difficult for you to be on podium. How do you feel? I don't know how many times people ask the same questions, but it seems that since few years, the tendency of our conception about female presence changes a lot. And it's like, for me, the pendulum in another extreme way. Before, maybe we were too much toward masculine tendency, and now it's because of the two extreme way, the another extreme way was needed just to catch up. Yeah. And I will see in few years, I hope in few years, it will be settled up in the middle. And we are all in the huge wave of human civilization activity. And I'm very hopeful to find all together the middle way in the harmony, in the serenity, to coexist in the diversity.
There's something also about the engender program that I think is really powerful that I'd like to speak to and honor in this space, which is that the incredible team that runs this program, what they do is they reach out also to some of us smaller organizations, if you like, who might have the knowledge, the grassroots knowledge, because we're working with some of these global majority women and non-binary folk who we think could really come together in very powerful and unexpected ways. And we had this beautiful conversation with the team last summer. Was it summer 2022? Before summer 2022. Is that right, Kate? It was, wasn't it? And I dropped your name there because we do want to shout, we do want to say your names. I think there's something really powerful, necessary, arguably, actually, when an organization as well established as the Royal Opera House says, we don't hold all the knowledge, others hold knowledge, and we want to share the platform because we're really interested in what happens when we extend beyond our sphere of influence, if you like, and we bring others in. And some really, really interesting partnerships emerged that summer. Some of that work that was being tested was really at the edge of what is opera, you know, and I think that was really just a really exciting moment to see what happens there. So I think there's some trailblazing and leading the way in what it looks like to experiment when you are the seat of power, if you like, and how necessary it is to bring others into that conversation as well.
Yeah. And speaking of partnerships, of course you are the joint CEO of Shubak, and this is part of the Shubak Festival. So I'd love you to just briefly sort of say something about the festival and the range of work that it contains, and it's happening right now, this week. And then also I'd really like you to address this very important question of what you would say to those who would argue that this, from our own communities, who would argue that this kind of work reinforces and perpetuates those sort of negative tropes about Arab or Muslim cultures, and that really we need more positive portrayals. So perhaps your thoughts on those.
I'm so glad that was the question. You know, when someone asks you, I have a very important question. The burden of representation falls upon you. No, yes, absolutely, because that's such an apt question. And Bushra and I can speak to that as well, because we were in, again, a space that was provided to us in the Royal Opera House to have this precisely that conversation around stereotypes, reinforcing them, and what is our duty around that. But just to give you a little plug about the Shubak Festival, we're on until the 9th of July. Check us out on www.shubak.co.uk. We're a biennial festival of contemporary Arab arts, and our whole purpose, if you like, is that we come to iconic buildings like the Royal Opera House, the National Theatre, the British Museum, Library, also to public spaces. So in spaces where folk might not encounter art, let alone Arab art. And we basically say we're here to connect. We have the same hopes, we have the same dreams, and look at how art is an incredible vehicle for us to try and figure out why we are where we are, some of our most urgent and impossible questions, getting our teeth into those really uncomfortable corners of what it means to be human, while also celebrating and being joyful about the fact that we can be together in these ways that only art can bring us together in. So this is what Shabak Festival is about. So it may be by and about the region and its diaspora, but it's for everybody, and that is what we always say. And then we come to this very important
meaty question, yeah.
And it is the question of, you know, when we take on issues that we feel we need to tackle, whether it's around dictatorships or patriarchy or environmental collapse or where the oil is, you know, and who's using the oil and who has more money and who doesn't. These kind of big questions that exist in our region and across the world as well. There is also the burden of representation of we already live in a world that wants to reduce and stereotype us and put us within this box of who we are. So, you know, this idea of belly dancers, bombers, and billionaires, you know, this is what the region is. And so we worry. We really worry every time we want to go in and talk about something that anyone, you know, in the UK would talk about without even thinking twice, because it's your right to speak about these things. I mean, artists are, you know, are among the hold up mirrors and hold up windows and hold up all sorts of spaces where we can start to interrogate and inquire about all sorts of questions. So it becomes really difficult. It can become very heavy when you're like, gosh, but this is a thing, you know? So yes, patriarchy and gender violence exists in the Arab region, in as much as it exists in other parts of the world, though differently, by the way, you know? So you know, domestic violence exists in Europe and the Northern Hemisphere, as we all know. But the attention, of course, goes to the Arab world that Arab men or Muslim men are violent. You know, that's like, this is a stereotype, you know, and it's reinforced to such an extent that it's internalized, like, and to the point where we are in danger of internalizing it as well. So we wanted to confront this. So what we did was we invited Bushra and playwright Hannah Khalil to host a session for us yesterday in this very building. So thank you, Royal Opera House, for hosting this space. And it was a space that was closed for global majority artists from the global majority world, to tackle this precise question. And the title of the session was, "The Stereotype is the Story." So what happens when the story you're telling, because you need to tell it, is actually feeding a reductionist stereotype? How do you deal with that, and how do you sit with it? And it was a really interesting conversation, wasn't it, Bushra? We had like 2 hours and a half that spilled into almost 3 hours of kind of...
Yes, it was like a nice, lovely, long panel, Lois Weaver styled, which it's a perfect format. And over some food, and we were just, everyone was so engaged and agreeing, and then it was building into something, and then I was like, aftercare time. Yeah.
And the importance of that.
Yeah, they're very important.
The aftercare.
Because I've never had that before after a session like that.
Yeah, because speaking of the body, and what you were saying so beautifully also, Bushra and Kanoko, is how the body traps trauma. And what I love about opera is like all of these things about how you're supposed to speak and use your voice and whatnot in a civilized way. You come to the opera and the voice is going, you know, it's going like wild. Sorry, I just destroyed your whole idea of opera in like a second. But, you know, like just the liberation out of the body of certain trapped traumas as well. So honoring also this idea of how the body traps traumas when you're navigating these very difficult conversations about what can and can't I say, and I'm going to self-censor, and every time we self-censor, we're trapping trauma. That's what we're doing. And I think what I emerged, I would be very curious to hear what you emerged with, Bushra, but it was beautiful to watch Woman at Point Zero last night, having experienced that morning, because for once I was watching and I was going, I have permission to see this story that is about the region, that may reinforce stereotypes, but I don't care. I don't care, because it's our story. It's one of our many stories, but it is our story. And I noticed that my body wanted to tense up, and then it was almost like I was giving myself permission to relax, that if it's reinforcing someone's stereotype, that's on them. They need to educate themselves. It's not my job, you know? And I just really valued that space. What did you go with, Bushra? I'm curious, what did you emerge
Well,
with?
I'd love to know, Bushra, to what extent then, building on what Ali has just said, in the book, of course, there's a sense of this being something of a call to action. You know, she sort of ends talking about Ferdowsi's courage, and that she has more courage than the narrator. And I'm just wondering whether you can say something about what you want the audience to take away from this in terms of a call to action. Is there a call to action in it? Can theatre ever be that?
Well, after the various performances we've had, I've had some conversations with some audience members, and they've come up with, I mean, they're like parents of sons or daughters who want to reconsider how they raise them after watching the opera. It can be as important as that. Because I mean, there's an element of conditioning that even women are not aware of, you know, growing up even. So, which is
one of the big themes of
themes.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to prescribe what they should come out with. But that was one of the things that made me feel like it was worth all this hard work.
It's one of those, and I'm sure the opera is the same as the book, in that it's one of those seminal things that everybody remembers the effect the first time they read it, and the effect that it had on them, and all these questions that started to circulate. And so that's, rather, as you say, rather than answering those questions, it's the fact that we open the conversation in that way that's really, really important. Finally, before I let you all go, I did just want to ask where we go from here, what happens next. I know that, has it already been at Aldborough Festival, or it's going to be at the Aldborough Festival, or how does that collaboration work?
Be at what festival?
Aldborough.
Yeah. So we're part of the Aldborough Extra. I mean, they were very much part of the genesis of the project. It started off as with their open space scheme. So that was our experimental playground and space. In conjunction with Shebeck and the Royal Opera House. But we've performed at Festival d'Aix, Aix-en-Provence, and the All Arias Festival in April, in Luxembourg.
And it will be in Valencia in September, and the next year in Korea.
Wow, amazing. So a good long life to come, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for taking the time to join this conversation, and it's a very, very important conversation, and I feel like we could talk all evening, but obviously we have to watch the amazing opera still to follow. So thank you. And if you're in the Linbury with us tonight, we hope you'll join us for this evening's performance of Woman at Point Zero, which starts at 7:45. Bushra, Kanako, Alia, thank you once again.
Thank you.
To our audience here in the Linbury Theatre and around the world, thank you for watching tonight's Insight, exploring Woman at Point Zero. Thank you.